Hello again. Welcome to another Tiny Desk sermon. We are going to look at the readings for this coming Sunday, which is Advent 4a. So it's the last Sunday in Advent. And because it's the last Sunday in Advent, it's the first time we really hear stories that are kind of taking us into Christmas. Well, I'm going to back up my screen here. So you see the readings. We get Isaiah 7, the sign of Emmanuel, and Matthew 1, which we'll get into in a minute. Let me just quickly read part of, this Isaiah 7 reading. And part of my job is always kind of break open the meaning of these texts, and especially at Christmas time when we have so many assumptions and traditions about what the texts mean, and then they don't always mean exactly what we think. So, the Lord spoke to Ahaz, saying, "Ask a sign of the Lord your God, let it be deep as Sheol or high as heaven." But Ahaz said, "I will not ask, and I will not put the Lord to the test." Then Isaiah said, "Hear then, O house of David, is it too little for you to weary mortals, that you weary my God also? Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Look, the young woman is with child and shall bear a son, and shall name him Emmanuel. He shall eat curds and honey by the time he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good. For before the child knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, the land before whose two kings you are in dread will be deserted." Excuse me. So, a couple things about the text. First of all, in verse 14, the Hebrew word in there is young woman. However, you may have heard this verse translated as the virgin is with child. So, in the Hebrew, the word actually means young woman. In the Hebrew translation into Greek, which happened around the 2nd century BC, what is now called the Septuagint, in that translation, they chose a Greek word that means virgin. So that then influences later translations of the Old Testament and later interpretations of those texts. So just keep that in mind. And then we get to shall name him Emmanuel. And I'm sure many of you know, Emmanuel literally means God with us, or the with us God. So the God who hasn't abandoned us might be more like it. Now, the curious thing in Isaiah is not that this child born to this young woman is God with us, is the sort of incarnate version of God. That's not what Isaiah is saying here. Christian tradition takes this text, and we'll see this in a second, as a way to interpret the birth of Jesus, but that's not what Isaiah is saying. What Isaiah is saying is there's this young woman who Ahaz apparently knows, who is having a child, and the birth of this child is a sign. And it is a sign that God is with us, because before this child grows up or even knows good from bad, the kings that you are pardon me, the kings that you are so afraid of are going to be gone. So Isaiah is saying, let this child that's being born be a sign to you that God is quickly going to redeem us. So it isn't that the child himself is the focus here. It's sort of around this being a sign that God is acting. Isaiah is sort of pointing to this and saying, let this be a sign for you. God is, just like the child's name, Emmanuel, God is with us. All right, so that's what I wanted to touch on for Isaiah, because it kind of helps break open our conceptions about what these texts are saying and how they get used in later tradition. All right, so now if we go to Matthew. Well, as I said, it's fourth Sunday in Advent. Advent leads up to Christmas. It anticipates Christmas, mostly just at the end of the season. But curiously enough, in this year's Gospel reading, we actually hear about the birth of Jesus before Christmas, because we get the Matthew version rather than the Luke version, which is always the Christmas version of the birth of Jesus that we hear. So, Matthew 1. Now, the birth of Jesus, the Messiah, took place in this way. When his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be with child from the Holy Spirit. Her husband Joseph, being a righteous man and unwilling to expose her to public disgrace, planned to dismiss her quietly. But just when he had resolved to do this, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, "Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins." All this took place to fulfill what had been spoken by the Lord through the prophet being Isaiah. "Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel," which means God is with us. When Joseph awoke from sleep, he did as the angel of the Lord commanded him. He took her as his wife, but had no marital relations with her until she had borne a son, and he named him Jesus. All right, there's a lot going on in this story. Let me point out a few things, then I'm going to show you the difference between this birth story and Luke's birth story, which is the more familiar one, and then talk a little bit about what this might mean. So, first of all, notice that this is really a story about Joseph. It's not much a story about Mary. It's an encounter that Joseph has with an angel rather than Mary's encounter with an angel. So what has happened is Joseph and Mary are engaged or betrothed, which was already like being married, already established the contractual relationship. But they weren't actually, Mary had not moved into his house yet, which would then be the marriage, and would be when they would consummate the marriage. So they haven't done that yet because they're not living together yet. So the scandal is apparent. Mary is pregnant. Joseph is being a righteous man, the text says, by planning to dismiss her, to divorce her, basically, because it must be that she was unfaithful. But he plans to do it quietly. He doesn't want to expose her to public disgrace. So we see Joseph is trying to act here with goodness and righteousness. So keep that in mind. Well, the angel of the Lord, a messenger of God, appears to him and gives him a whole different interpretation of what's happening. First of all, he calls him Joseph, son of David. So in Matthew, we didn't hear the first 17 verses of Matthew here. Matthew gives a whole genealogy of the birth of Jesus. And in Matthew's gospel, Joseph is the descendant of David, which is essential for Jesus to be born the Messiah. Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid, for this is not what you think it is. God is at work in this mess. And you are to take him as your son and name him Jesus. When it says, for he will save his people from their sins, that isn't really what the name Jesus means. Jesus is the Greek form of the Hebrew name Joshua, or Yeshua, which means Yahweh saves, the Lord saves. Matthew adds this interpretation to that by adding, he will save his people from their sins. And then he says, confusingly, this all took place to fulfill what the Lord said in Isaiah. Look, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall name him Emmanuel. But he names him Jesus. We'll get to that in a minute, why that oddity is there. And then at the end, it says that he named him Jesus. And by doing that, Joseph is taking Jesus as his own son by naming him. So Joseph has embraced this situation. His initial response was to run away from it, but to do it for the right reasons, and found out that there's something else going on. Well, let's take a minute to compare these stories, which we're probably much more familiar with the birth narrative in Luke than we are in Matthew. And they're quite different, and they're told for different reasons. So, in Matthew, we get an unnamed angel visits Joseph. In Luke, the angel Gabriel announces to Mary that she is going to give birth to Jesus. And then in Matthew, to kind of just go straight through Matthew here for a second, Mary's son is born in Bethlehem in Joseph's house. So, in Matthew, they live in Bethlehem. That's where they live. They didn't travel there. They live there. And Joseph has a house there. And Mary hasn't moved into the house yet. Well, now she has, and Jesus is born in Joseph's house. And then we get the story of the Magi and the star and the warning about that Herod is going to try to find this newborn king, and does so by destroying all of the children, much like in Exodus with Pharaoh. And so the Magi get messages from another angel, and then Joseph gets another message, and they flee before this persecution. And then they go to Egypt, and then they come and settle in Nazareth. And that's how Joseph, Mary, and Jesus end up being from Nazareth. But in the beginning, they're from Bethlehem. In Luke, as you know, it's quite different. So the angel comes to Mary. Mary visits Elizabeth. She sings the Magnificat. Elizabeth gives birth to John the Baptist. Matthew doesn't say anything about any of this. And skipping ahead here, Mary and Joseph journey to Bethlehem because of this census that we hear about. Matthew knows nothing about any of that. And that it's partly to get the birth to happen in Bethlehem, because again, if Jesus is going to be son of David, he has to be born in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth to Jesus in a stable or somewhere outside of the inn, not in Joseph's home. And then we get the story of the shepherds. The angels appear to the shepherds, and the shepherds go to see the birth of Jesus at the stable. And then they return back home to Nazareth. So as you can see, I'm so sorry I can't get my throat clear. These two stories are very different. One of the key details they have in common is that Jesus is born of a virgin. Now if we go back to the text. Now in the ancient world, if you have somebody who is born who is supposed to be extraordinary, supposed to be a historic figure, a world-changing figure, their birth had to reflect this. So typically two things are used to say that a birth is extraordinary. One is that the person is born of a virgin, and the other is that they are born of a divine father. And that's of course, the implications of our story here. So if anything, whenever you think about these details and the differences between the two narratives, both are trying to make it very clear that Jesus is an extraordinary person beyond the ordinary, and that his birth is a symbol of that extraordinary existence. Now, what else do we get here? Go back to Joseph. Joseph wanted to run away because what was happening didn't match up with the sort of normal righteousness of the day. So Joseph was doing the right thing, and he was trying to do it with kindness and gently, to quietly dismiss Mary, not, make her a social pariah, but just like, okay, this is not my son. First of all, Joseph is thinking. Second of all, this isn't what it's supposed to be, and certainly this can't be God's will. So he is planning to do the righteous, good thing, and to do it as well as he can. But then he discovers, and this is really the heart of the text for us, that the very thing that he thinks could not possibly be God at work is God at work. And so the message he gets from the angel transforms his sense of what's happening here. He is somehow able to hear this message and trust that God was at work in this situation. And therefore, instead of giving up and running away, Joseph goes beyond the standard cultural expectations of good or ethical behavior. Instead of being righteous, he kind of goes way beyond it to be abundantly righteous. Instead of just being good, he's exceedingly good in how he responds to the situation, because he's able to see that God was in this. So it's curious how we can be so focused on handling things in life that don't match up to what we think they should be by simply going according to the cultural norms that we're familiar with. But what happens when the very things that we think are outside of God's will start to be revealed to us, so they're actually, God's in it. God is with us in this mess. That can perhaps open us up to, instead of doing the expected good thing, doing the exceedingly good thing. Instead of ordinary righteousness, abundant righteousness. So, the Christian tradition, of course, makes more out of the God with us, Emmanuel, in the birth of Jesus than what I said about what the Isaiah text is really saying. And you see that especially in the way Matthew brackets the whole story. So as I said here in the text we just heard, Joseph is to name the baby Jesus or Joshua, and then Matthew says, and this fulfills what Isaiah said, that he would be called Emmanuel, God with us. And you're kind of like, wait, what? That doesn't match up. And then only when you get to the very end of Matthew's gospel, in the resurrection story, where the disciples are back on the mountaintop with Jesus, which is always where Jesus teaches them things, and he sends them out on what we call the Great Commission, and says, behold, I am with you to the end of the age. So that is the Emmanuel truth coming through after the death and resurrection of Jesus. So this Emmanuel prophecy brackets the entire story, and it's kind of like when you see a movie or hear a story and there's some detail at the beginning that's like, oh, what is that about? And then it kind of disappears from the story, and even disappears from your memory, and then it comes back at the end and say, oh, yeah, that's right, that was at the beginning. That's what Matthew's doing here. So what might it mean to think about that in Christ, God is with us, I like to think of it as, what is that really saying? It's saying God has not abandoned us. Even when we're in the situations of life that we think God could not possibly be in, like, for instance, a young woman who's engaged but ends up pregnant before they live together. What could it mean that God is with us and has not abandoned us in the mess of human reality? And when we can embrace that God is with us in this mess, then we can approach life, our lives, other people's lives, from a different perspective, I think. So, in a way, Joseph being willing to be with Mary and Jesus, and by basically taking on Jesus as his own son, is parallel to who God is. That God, like Joseph, being abundantly righteous and good beyond expectation, so is God. God is, shattering the norms that we think are the way things have to be, and the way God must be, so that we see something greater, which is that God is not just good, but is exceedingly loving. And sometimes it's only in the mess of the life reality that we have to deal with that comes through. So those are my initial thoughts on this wonderful story. We can ponder a little more how God might be with us and how we might be called to not run away from life's challenges, but try to find God in them, and change our response to them, like Joseph. So, let's see, tonight, December 14th, Wednesday at 7, we have our Advent evening prayer service. It will be in person and on live stream, so join us for that. And then Sunday is Advent 4. And then a week from today is Tiny Desk Sermon, my last one. I'm not going to try to do Tiny Desk in January because things are going to be a little too busy and crazy with holidays and then me kind of winding down things here. So next week is my last one. I'm going to celebrate that with you because this has been a really enjoyable thing to do, and I appreciate everyone's participation in whatever way you have. We'll celebrate that. And then I'm going to ponder way down the road whether Tiny Desk Sermon is a part of my future ministry in a different way. I'll think more about that this week. All right, thank you for joining me, and hope to see you Sunday, whether in person or on live stream.